Thanks very much, Jim, for having me here to talk about carbon negative technology. I love that I came up after DJ Spooky. He was talking about the role of art and science together. I think in 2010, I did an event with DJ Spooky in Chicago after Greenfest, where we remixed some live music samples that were taken at Greenfest and talked about the need for carbon negative solutions and technologies. So very serendipitous. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the global carbon cycle and providing a reference frame for how the carbon cycle works and why the need for carbon negative technologies is critical. So this is an example of a simplified global carbon cycle. You can see on the left is a natural cycle. There's a total natural flux of carbon that is several hundred gigatons a year, and the anthropomorphic addition to that from human burning of fossil fuels and agriculture net adds 6 gigatons of carbon to the year per year to the atmosphere, and the Earth naturally draws down about half of that. So there's an addition of carbon in the atmosphere and the atmospheric cycle, and this is a challenge and a problem. A few observations. There are over 50 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent CO2 per year going into the air, and that's accelerating. That's rising over 2% per year, and it's happening even faster. The global carbon cycle is not closed. The ocean does sequester CO2, about 1% of the total CO2, or 30 to 40% of human or anthropomorphic addition. That dissolves into the ocean. But that's a challenge because it creates acidifying of the ocean, and the ocean naturally changes with time. Over millennia, the ocean will release and absorb CO2, and this is an important cycle. And our impact on that, or the human contribution to that, is significant. We are changing that flux, and it's causing a systematic set of effects that we ultimately need to reduce the complete, for about 40 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere to stabilize the climate. And the upshot to this is that there are significant opportunities in energy, agriculture, building materials, water infrastructure that we can look at in terms of the utilization of existing CO2 in the atmosphere and new technologies. So the approach that we're taking today as a society is the sort of wedges approach. This was work done by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a sort of sensible strategy of looking at how to reduce global CO2 emissions by doing some combination of adaptation, of reducing emissions, of developing new technologies. It's a portfolio of different solutions, energy efficiency, but and it does have the potential to keep the CO2 level below 500 parts per million, which, while double the pre-industrial levels, we have sort of considered the safe level to stop climate change from reaching above 2 degrees centigrade. However, we know that this is not likely enough to avoid serious and dramatic climate change. In fact, and I'll speak in a little bit, there's been some new things coming out in the last few months that speak to this directly. But this natural cycle depends on the natural absorption rate, and it does not address the elevated emissions that we're seeing now, and we don't have any solution past 2055. So these are things that we have to keep in mind as we have to consider this. And in addition to that, we know that the climate changes destructively on its own. A couple 100,000 years ago, New York was under a mile of ice, and that is a natural cycle that may happen again. And we can look at the development of technologies, of carbon negative technologies, of producing products and energy from carbon that's already in the atmosphere as a mechanism to control and stabilize the Earth's atmosphere. So some new insights. Looking at the picture on the right, this is pretty scary. This is some data from January to August of this year, and globally, we've seen record heat all over the planet. But you notice this blue spot just under Greenland there, and we look at that and we said, this is a big problem. That's a result of ice water melting and a large amount coming off. And this is a big challenge. And James Hansen recently published a paper kind of looking at these climate models, and he published it in July, and it's been an interesting paper because he published it before it was peer-reviewed. But what he looked at was the way that ice melts. He said, in the previous climate models, we forgot to take into account that when ice melts, it breaks. And when ice breaks, it has more surface area, and then it melts faster. Oops. Well, what it's showing is that there's a potential that the ice melt could be happening 10 times as fast, of possibly 50 to 200 years seeing multi-level meters of sea ice rise, or sea ice melt. And that's a nonlinear process. And in addition to this, in 2013, the IPCC took a look at the way that CO2 is absorbed naturally. And they took a systems approach and they said, how are the different dynamics in the Earth changing as CO2 is absorbed? And what you can see on this graph on the right is that carbon dioxide, carbon dioxide, when you start with the kilogram of CO2 in the atmosphere, over a 100-year cycle, there's still 40% of it left. And it's because of this systemic feedback cycle between CO2 and the natural process. So we know that it takes much longer for CO2 that's absorbed into the atmosphere to come back through a natural cycle and be reabsorbed. And these complex feedback mechanisms, like ocean acidification, is actually delaying the natural absorption of CO2. So what does this all speak to? This all speaks to the need for carbon-negative technologies being extremely important. And in fact, the IPCC recently has said carbon-negative technologies need to be addressed. So a little bit more background on the IPCC's work, and then I'll talk about some technologies. Here's the sort of domain of optimism that the IPCC reported on, this upper scenario and lower scenario, which is looking at gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions per year over time. You know, this is kind of business as usual with adaptation strategies, new technology, and this is real aggressive work. So they call this a domain of optimism. And within the domain of optimism, it is possible that we can stay below the safe level of CO2, being defined as sort of 550 ppm, which many argue is still a very unsafe scenario. But this being a scenario in which we can approach developing technologies and reducing CO2 emissions to reach this level. What can carbon-negative technologies achieve, right? Previously, the slides are looking at strategies like adaptation, carbon-neutral technologies, reduction of emissions, increased efficiency, but none of that gets us into a position where we are net zero emissions, which is ultimately where we need to get as a society, as a global society. So when we take a look at the potential for negative carbon technologies, when we apply them, we can rapidly decrease the total CO2 emission scenario and get ourselves to zero, and even into a regime where we are taking more CO2 out of the atmosphere than we're putting in. So there's clearly a need for developing carbon-negative technologies. Avoided carbon is simply not a solution. With the new work that's been done on how long CO2 takes to be absorbed and how much development is happening in Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, places like this, there's a huge amount of additional CO2 production going online. In fact, I went to India a couple of years ago, and the guy who was selling the power plants to the coal companies in India said that they had planned and already paid for 7 new Indias worth of coal power production in the next 25 years. And that was about 4 years ago. So there's already, I mean, no matter what we do now today in terms of trying to mitigate coal and replace it with renewable energy, these assets have a long life, and they'll continue to operate for 50 to 100 years. And these emission scenarios are going to keep getting worse even as we develop new technologies to address them. So the answer is we need to develop negative solutions that are profitable that can take CO2 directly out of the air, thus CO2 negativity being required. And the technologies that we're talking about are carbon dioxide removal technologies that make this negative carbon possible. So with these technologies, we can achieve a net zero emission scenario within the next 100 years. What are these technologies? Well, there's air capture of CO2, and there's a number of firms working on this. A firm that we work with is called Global Thermostat. This is a picture of their device. And if you can pull CO2 out of the air, then you can make useful products of CO2. You can commoditize CO2 as a feedstock. You can make fuels, plastics, building materials, all kinds of different things, agricultural products out of CO2 if you have it, if you can pull it out of the air. There's also biochar, which is taking biomass and slowly pyrolyzing it to make a char material. You get some energy out, and that char material is then put back into the soil as a soil amendment, increases agricultural production rates, and moves that carbon from an atmospheric cycle into a geologic cycle, which takes it out of the atmospheric cycle for about 10,000 years. There's a new concept in place called BECCS, which is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And what you're essentially talking about there is taking CO2 from biomass, burning biomass, making CO2, and then storing the ash in geologic formations. So it's basically taking CCS technologies that have been developed for coal and putting those on biomass power plants. But there's some big questions about that. How much does it cost? Does it make sense? It probably requires a carbon price signal. Right now we don't have a carbon price signal. So the investment in the space isn't there. Nobody's willing to take that investment on. It's too risky. And then as a last resort, there's a lot of people looking at enhanced weathering, looking at basically geoengineering methodologies for taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and dumping it into the oceans or making silica salts, something like this. But this is potentially very dangerous and no direct way to monetize it. So these are the solutions we're looking at now. These are the solutions that we have that we can address carbon negative technologies with, the carbon negative problem with. And what I want to talk about a little bit is how these solutions can be applied in a systems approach. Right now, there's the climate change and CO2 in the atmosphere is putting huge pressure on a number of social issues like water. Water rights, water access is a major problem globally, and it's being exacerbated by climate change. Currently, 10% of the world's population remains without access to improved water supply, and the projection is in 2030, the world will be 40% short of clean water. And it's currently the #1 cause of disease in the world. That's getting worse. It's putting pressure on agricultural systems, energy systems, and we have a clear need for resilient infrastructure. Rising sea levels, stronger storms are going to affect the infrastructure we have in place. And the question is, how do we develop and implement technology solutions that can adapt to this? So what my company did, is we took a systems approach looking at how do we develop technologies and develop a system that can be carbon negative, address the negative carbon issue, but also provide a number of resources and services that are required. So what we've done is we've partnered with this company, Global Thermostat, where we take carbon dioxide out of the air, and we take raw sewage, raw municipal sewage, and we combine those in a system to grow algae biomass. And we have done this at our plant, pictured there in Alabama. We have systems that float offshore for growing the algae, as well as onshore. And what we do is we grow the algae, and when the algae is grown, the byproduct is clean water. This water meets all the discharge standards for the EPA, and is even potable. You can drink it. When we separate the water, we get algae, and we developed a process to convert that algae, algae into fuel, called hydrothermal liquefaction. And hydrothermal liquefaction is interesting. It's basically just a high temperature, high pressure way to convert any kind of wet biomass into fuel. If you think about all the oil from underground, it was algae that was around 500 million years ago. And with time, temperature, and pressure, it was converted to crude oil. And so what we do is we grow our own algae on sewage with CO2 from the air, and in 60 seconds, we convert that algae into light sweet crude oil. And the byproduct that we get is biochar. So what we've been able to do is we've been able to develop a system where we can monetize CO2 that's already in the air, treat wastewater, and do so at about 20% of the cost of existing wastewater systems, while generating energy, so energy positive wastewater treatment. And the byproducts, the products that we produce, clean water, carbon negative fuel, and biochar. That's used as an agricultural amendment. And when we do this, we've taken a look at all the life cycle numbers. And we've been able to quantify exactly the amount of CO2 that we're directly putting into the ground as well as avoiding. So with our process, for every about 100 kilograms of carbon or about 367 kilograms of CO2 we take out of the atmosphere, through the CO2 capture process using global thermostats technology, making algae, producing biofuels, again, about 40% of that carbon goes into the soil as biochar, as a fertilizer, as a soil amendment. And the fuel is then burned and released. And of course, when that fuel is burned, that carbon is going back into the atmospheric cycle, but it's 60% less than the carbon that we took out. So there's a net storage of 60% of that carbon value into the soil, and an avoided 330 kilograms of carbon dioxide that you don't need to pull out from petroleum. So when you put all this together, there's a net life cycle reduction of 477 kilograms of CO2 for every 100 kilograms of carbon that we pull out of the air. And so going back to the first slide, what we've been able to do is close the carbon cycle. We can take CO2 that's already in the air, that's in the air all around us. We don't need point sources. We don't need power plants. We can generate energy. We can generate fuels. We can make fuels, plastics, chemical commodities, power, anything that you can make in a traditional oil refinery we can make. And we make biochar. Thus, it is possible to develop infrastructure to remove the net anthropogenic carbon that's going into the atmosphere by utilizing the carbon that's already in the atmosphere to generate useful products. So I wanted to return then back to the IPCC scenarios and kind of take a look at what's possible. Where can we get, and how much will it cost, and what are the risks associated with this? Sorry. So this curve comes from a colleague, Peter Eisenberger, from Columbia University, who developed that global thermostat system. And this is looking at the IPCC curves within that domain of optimism. And what he did is he took a sort of middle-of-the-road scenario, looking at what is the sort of balance between the aggressive scenario and the less aggressive scenario within that domain of optimism. And then what he did is he applied a capacity factor. If we assume 1 million tons of CO2 are removed per year, you're adding 1 million tons per year of CO2 removal out of the atmospheric cycle into the ground. What does this look like? So here's the curve without any CO2 removal, if we just stick with business as usual. Clearly, we're getting well above the safe zone within halfway through the century. However, if we start in 2010, if we were to have started in 2010, for example, by starting with removing 1 million tons of CO2 per year, we can stabilize the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, never even reaching 460. If we wait 10 years later, we start to get to the dangerous zone, but we can stabilize 20 years down the road. So there's this latency effect, and that makes sense, right? Because when we release CO2 into the atmosphere, it has a climate-forcing latency effect that takes tens to hundreds of years to come out. So this is shown in this graph. And then what we've done is we've looked at the total removal capacity about how much CO2 would be required to be removed from the atmosphere to avoid the 550 ppm scenario on an annual basis. And if we started with a capacity growth factor in 2010, about 8 gigatons per year of removal capacity is required to stabilize the Earth's climate. However, as we wait 10, 20, 30 years later, the total capacity factor increases greatly. And again, this is looking at that middle of the road from the domain of optimism proposal about what these emission targets are. And then if we look at the total concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere with negative carbon technologies, we can look at these 5 scenarios, and we can see that it is possible to stabilize the Earth's atmosphere under 500 ppm within the scenarios before the end of the century, if we act now. And even if we take a look at the less optimistic scenario, that top line in the domain of optimism, we are still seeing that it is possible to avoid going beyond 500 parts per million and staying within the safe zone, but we need to add significantly more capacity to it. But still, it's within a reasonable range. So what are the takeaways? Carbon negative technology is absolutely required. It is just not enough that we focus on developing carbon neutral technologies. Wind and solar, electric cars, these things are critical and we need them. But what they do is they buy us more time. They don't get us on the learning curve now of drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere. And avoided carbon will not address the climate change threat that we see today. From the last slides I was just showing, there's a significant, any delay in implementation risk has a significantly increased cost. And that cost has a significant time delay. And the longer the delay, the more CO2 needs to be removed, the more infrastructure we need to build to remove this CO2. But the upside of the story is that we have economical solutions that work today. We've been able to demonstrate a wastewater treatment facility that produces energy, more energy than it uses, is about 20% of the cost of existing facilities, and can be done at small modular scales, and is carbon negative. So these are economical solutions that work within even the current framework of the price of oil and competitive technologies, and we've already demonstrated this. So the question is, when are we going to implement this infrastructure? How are we going to get ourselves to the point where we start scaling this negative carbon infrastructure? And we need to start having a conversation around how do we value this, right? If we look at $100 of investment today in a negative carbon infrastructure versus a neutral carbon infrastructure, what is the value of that investment over the lifetime of that asset, over 30 to 50 years? And how much work has that $100 done to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere? We don't really have a way of quantifying that. We need to. We need to figure that out. And that's part of what we have to do as we start thinking about this next COP event in Paris. And carbon negative is now beginning to be a part of the conversation. And we're going to come out of Paris with some kind of, likely with some kind of carbon price signal. But the question that I have is, what's the road from Paris? It's going to be useful to have a carbon price signal. It's going to be useful to have governments working together to try to solve this issue. But we know very clearly that if we're focusing on adaptation strategies, on carbon neutral technologies, we're not going to get there. But it's a good start. So with that, I thank you very much for your time and appreciate it.